life. If work sucks, you better have a great social life, and none of us do.
Unless you get good sleep.
You're not a team until you have a common objective.
We call it the great detachment that we're experiencing right now. It's unfortunate because it can be fixed.
We're losing something by remote work.
The people that are fully in person who are kind of being forced back in, they're the least engaged. So we've got to kind of strike a balance somewhere.
Machines are managed, people are led. Welcome to Lessons Learned. My guest today is Dr. Jim Harter, who's the chief scientist for Gallup's workplace management and well-being practices. For almost 40 years, Jim has been studying the way we interact with our workplace, with our leaders, and with each other. His latest book, Culture Shock, is a fascinating look at how the pandemic has affected the modern workplace environment and affected our ability to lead people and keep them engaged with their work and with each other. Jim, thanks so much for being with me today on Lessons Learned.
Great to be with you, John. Thanks for having me.
Why don't we start with kind of an overview of, I think people are familiar with Gallup as a polling organization, but I don't think people understand how broad the research that Gallup does. So maybe tell us a little bit about the work that you do at Gallup and have for the last almost 4 decades.
Yeah, so I work with our team to advance research, in particular related to how organizations can improve, how leaders can improve, and how we can make people's lives better and productive at the same time. And so our work, we've interviewed 64 million people around the globe in terms of how they feel about their workplaces. We go micro inside organizations and look not only at how an overall organization is doing, but we do a census survey of organizations, thousands of organizations around the world. And we, when I say micro, we map the data down to the team level. So we're helping organizations and their managers inside of teams understand how things are going and how they can improve the culture and performance. And then at a macro level, we study employee engagement and well-being across 150 different countries. We've got this tool that I helped build back in 2005 called the Gallup World Poll. And these are random samples of the population of citizens around the world where we ask questions about their lives. We ask questions about their work. We ask questions about how they perceive their governments. We ask them questions about how they perceive their food and shelter and safety and all sorts of things. But my main focus in terms of what our team works on is the workplace, because people spend so much time working. We think it's a vital component to the well-being of individuals and the performance of organizations.
Yeah, I used to jokingly tell people you spend more of your adult life working than you do anything else. If work sucks, you better have a great social life, and none of us do.
Unless you get good sleep.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So what I think is interesting about what you're doing is so much of leadership and kind of work-related content and writing is anecdotal, right? It's personal experience. It's, there isn't a lot of really objective data. And I think especially when you're talking about macroscopic trends like we are, post-COVID, like your latest book, Culture Shock, talks about, you're going to see it in data long before you see it anecdotally. And I think that anecdotal information is so dependent upon the person and where they are and all those things that part of the reason I wanted to have you on and talk about this is that you are seeing macroscopic trends, especially post-COVID, that I think we should talk about.
Yeah, we are. In fact, some of the trends that we saw post-COVID, we saw beginning pre-COVID. For instance, people at work were really rating workplace flexibility as a top priority in terms of a perk. More organizations were thinking more about flexibility. Work and life became more blended together than ever before. And then suddenly in March, in the U.S. anyway, in March of 2020, we had this sudden shift where people who could work remote, and there's a lot more people than we thought, had a very different experience with work. And that had some, let's just call them aftershocks that are still reverberating today in terms of what's going on in work and society. And I think that means we need to adjust. Leaders need to adjust. Managers need to adjust. Employees need to adjust. Customers need to adjust. And those patterns, I think, give us some insights into how we do that.
I think we all kind of have an intuitive impression of the effect of the pandemic and the effect of remote work on us. And I guess part of it is driven by your personal experience, but I think we all kind of feel like maybe this was not a perfect experiment. And maybe it didn't go as well as we thought it did. And I think the farther away from it we get, the more we're starting to recognize that maybe it wasn't going as well as we thought it was. But what are the big trends that you guys noticed, and are noticing post-pandemic?
Yeah, and I think of it as the big forced experiment. When we ask people how they experienced it, that there's increase in autonomy and freedom and independence. They learned they could do their work a bit differently. And there's thing in behavioral economics called the endowment effect. When we get something that we didn't expect to get, it takes a lot more to take it from us. So that independence and autonomy is something that people didn't want to necessarily give up. They didn't want to. The number one reason they said they didn't want to go back to the office was the commute. So they wanted good reasons for that. They rethought that. They rethought their jobs. Some of the patterns that we've seen in the data since the pandemic have been gradually, and this started second half of 2021 in the so-called Great Resignation, where people started changing up jobs and everything. There began to be more of a detachment than we've ever seen before. So before the pandemic hit, we saw a decade of growth and engagement, and now it's slowly trickling back down to where we now see people are more detached from their employer. Some of this relates to lack of trust in institutions, but organizations are institutions too, and people have become detached. We call it the great detachment that we're experiencing right now. It's unfortunate because it can be fixed. It doesn't have to be this way. People are less clear about their expectations. Among young people, 40% are clear on their job expectations. That you can't separate, the remote hybrid type work from that. It doesn't mean that they can't work in that environment, but inevitably, what we've experienced in terms of being separated from work for the people who can work remote, the way I say it is physical distance kind of tends to lead to mental distance to some extent, and we have to be very intentional and get management right if we're going to fix that. So 40% clear on expectations. Only 36% of young people strongly agree someone at work encourages their development. It used to be being young had a development advantage. That's not there anymore. And we've got to fix that because being young, you've got to have chances to develop and to progress your career. It's the number one priority for young people.
I think, one of the things that we saw just in our work environment, and I've heard from other business leaders that they saw was, it was kind of a reshuffling of the balance of power between the organization and the individual. And even leaders in organizations were doing the math on that balance between work and life and kind of, who has the power in the relationship. And I don't think we really understood initially how much, what I call osmotic learning, right? You're just being in the same room with somebody, you learn from them. Passing them in the hallway, you have, I noticed it with the people that directly report to me that now it took an intentional call. It was no longer like I saw them in the hall and they said, "Hey, let me ask you something." It was now it had to be an intentional call. And I noticed that even people that I talk to, 20 times a day, normally I was talking to, once every couple of days. So you can see where, the people in organizations are going to begin to not only not share information, but also lose those little water cooler conversations and personal interactions. Is that kind of how the data is bearing out?
Yeah, and in-person time does matter. We're seeing most of the shifts happening. It's happening across the board, but they're more predominant in terms of changes, like feeling connected to the purpose of the organization, connected to the culture of the organization, more so for hybrid and remote workers. Now, it doesn't mean that we can't fix that for hybrid and remote workers, but we've got to be intentional if we're going to do that. From the leader's perspective, what do they care about? Leaders care about the customer. And so when employees start becoming more detached, if they don't have great management that pulls them in and has some cadence in terms of how they're communicating with people, then that detachment that I was talking about leads to them feeling less committed to customers. And when they're less committed to customers, it affects the bottom line. So leaders have every right to be concerned with this. I think there's ways to kind of think about this increased autonomy, which has always been important for people to be engaged, and combining that with some structure and some predictability in terms of how we build cultures going forward that can work. But we've got to have the right principles in mind if we're going to get that right. But to your point, John, yeah, we're seeing that in the data. And if you look into all the really credible research studies that have been done on in-person time, it matters. We did studies on social time well before the pandemic. We know that social time matters, not the total amount of time, but it has to. You need to make it happen if you can. If you can't, also, people that were used to working together, it worked out a lot better, working remote because they already knew each other's tendencies. And when you know each other's strengths, that sort of shortens the distance between people, and you can pick up on the last conversation. But if you just leave it to chance, it doesn't work very well. And right now, unfortunately, people are leaving it to chance too much.
Well, and that brings up an interesting point, though, because if people have worked together for a long time, if you and I have worked together for 10 years, and I know you and I know the way you think, and I know the way that you work, you being remote from me is not necessarily going to affect our relationship that much, and it's not going to affect our communication that much. We're going to pass, we're going to miss the passing hallway conversations. Mm-hmm. But where this strikes me would be really detrimental is people who've not been in the organization for a long time.
Yeah.
New employees, younger employees. Are you seeing that this is hindering development?
Without question. That's where we're seeing the downward trend. The greatest is among younger employees and people entering the workforce. Because they need that connection, whether they know it or not, and they might default immediately on, it's just more convenient for me to work in a remote setting, and that's where I feel like I can get my work done. But if they don't have managers and leaders who really encourage them to get with other people in person, they're going to miss out. It's just human nature that when you run into somebody in the hallway, you might solve a problem in 5 minutes that you would not have even thought of trying to solve before. You may get advice from somebody that you might not have ever run into before. Not everything can be formalized through these screens that we're in now. The informal part is really important. I think leaders that's what leaders are concerned about. They're used to seeing that in the past. Some of them don't really trust the people from a distance, but others just know that they're missing out on some of those connections that happen naturally that build a culture.
Well, and I think you're seeing, kind of now a whiplash effect. It's, President Trump just ordered all the federal workers back to the office, and there may be ulterior motives for that, but you're seeing more and more large corporations saying, no, you're coming back into the office. So I think we all kind of have this intuitive sense that it may not be working as well, but I think that what I like about the research that you've done and what's in the book is you are actually documenting, like, no, your gut instinct is accurate here. We're losing something by remote work.
Well, and there's a problem on in person. So the people that are fully in person too, who are kind of being forced back in, they're the least engaged. So there's that side of it too. So we've got to kind of strike a balance somewhere, where people have some choice, but at the same time there's some structure to when they're together. And I think that part's really important.
Well, and it also strikes me, talking about younger workers for a second, like it also strikes me that you're talking about a generation that is not necessarily, the last two generations don't necessarily derive all of their identity from their work the way prior generations did. And maybe, are much more willing to be mobile and change jobs and are not planning to stay at a corporation for 30 years. And then you combine that with the fact that they're not building the deep social relationships at work. They're not feeling connected to the organization. And it strikes me as a recipe that's bad for the organization, and it's bad for the individuals working in the organization.
It is. It's at their detriment, really, because if you think about, one of the items that we have measured for decades, do you have an opportunity to do what you do best every day? It takes repetition. It takes experience inside of an organization to get that right. And if you keep changing jobs, you might change for the next a little bit higher paycheck, or because you think it'll be better for you individually. But if you don't get some repetition inside of an organization and get those interactions happening, which is part of human nature, you'll never truly do what you do best. Because doing what you do best involves practice. It involves working with other people, knowing what they do best, and offsetting that with what you do best. I can just think about my career of almost 40 years and how much my job has changed, where I've been able to do more of what I figured out I can do best, and what and other people picking up areas they do best that I hate to do. And we can only figure that out if we're working with similar teams across time, and those interactions between a team make a big difference. And if you try to separate work and life, which for some people are splitters and they do want to separate work and life, but you shouldn't do that at the detriment of having a job where you feel connected to the mission or purpose of that work. Why would you want to spend most of your time doing, repetitive work or work that you don't feel pride in, or work that you don't feel like you're really fulfilled in terms of the outcome that you're getting? That's going to affect your well-being, and it's going to wear on you over time. You might not notice it immediately, but you're going to notice it over time. We know there's physiological connections, cortisol levels that in studies that we've done, that cortisol is higher for people who aren't engaged in their work, who feel sort of separated from their work and their workplace. And so the ramifications are much bigger than just where we're working. In fact, how people are managed matters multiple times more than where they are sitting. We've talked a lot about remote work, but if you have great managers, you can make it work. You can make hybrid work. You can make fully remote work if it's right for the person and their job, right? There's some people that have very independent work that they're doing. But multiple times more important than all that, and we spend a lot of time on it, is the quality of the managing. And that's what we've got to get right going forward. We've got to change how people are managed.
Well, I think that's a great segue for us to talk about kind of your lessons learned here from the post-pandemic environment. And if I am a leader, what are Jim's lessons learned on what I need to be doing to ensure that I'm keeping that engagement with the people that I lead?
I would bring it down to three things, and they're all performance management related elements that aren't that hard to pull off, but we've got to have some habits and some rituals, and we've got to build in some structure to make sure they happen. One is setting goals and priorities. To set goals and priorities in the right way, they've got to be clear, they've got to be collaborative, and they've got to be aligned with what the organization's trying to get done. The low-hanging fruit here in goal setting that a lot of people ignore because we tend to think as leaders instinctively about delegation is collaborative goal setting, where we're sitting down with the person and we're getting their ownership in terms of what the goals are, and we're helping them think about how those goals affect the rest of the organization and what we're trying to get done as an organization. So just involving people in goal setting. Many times people set higher goals than what the leader would have set for them in the first place, but then there's some ownership. So the low-hanging fruit there is setting goals and priorities. The second area that's really important and incredibly important is having ongoing conversations with people, making sure that you're having frequent, focused, and future-oriented conversations with people with a cadence. And what I mean by a cadence, and I'll just say from our research what we learned is that having a meaningful conversation once a week with each person you manage is important. Some people will need to adjust that a little bit, but think about the principle of that. If you have a meaningful conversation once a week with each person you manage, you're in touch with what they're doing. You can reframe their goals if you need to. You can recognize them if you see that they did something exceptional, if they did good work. You can talk with them about how they collaborate with their team. You're doing the same thing with the rest of their team, so you hear from other people what they've accomplished and what they've done and how they've collaborated with them. And you can leverage their strengths. One thing that happens in a meaningful conversation is that the manager knows something about each person's strengths, and you can adjust their job so that they can use their strengths and leverage the strengths of their coworkers effectively. So goals and priorities, ongoing conversations. The third thing, very important in a hybrid, remote kind of environment, in any environment really, is accountability. There's no way we can have this high level of autonomy without accountability. And I'm not talking about punitive accountability. I'm talking about accountability that's achievement-oriented, that's fair and accurate, so the employee knows that how they're being held accountable is fair in terms of what they're trying to get done, and accurate. And above all, that it's developmental, that you're helping them think about how their work that they just accomplished is affecting their future. And there's kind of three areas there that I think any organization can build accountability around. And one is the individual accomplishments of each person. So do you have some ways of knowing how that individual is performing? Do you have some ways of knowing how they collaborate with their team, whether they're in person or from a distance? And do you know, and this is really important from the perspective of leaders, I think, is do you know what value they're bringing to the customer? whether the customer is external or internal, however you define customer or who you're serving, how are they bringing value? And how do they know they're bringing value? And that's why those frequent conversations are important, because managers anymore need to be in touch with what's going on in the lives of each person that they manage. And so that cadence, I think, is important. And I think that's the skill part of it, that if the manager knows their own strengths, they can build skills and cadence in terms of how they develop their work environment and their culture. And the best organizations we've studied, so let's just give you some perspective here. Globally, about 20% of people are engaged in their work. In the U.S. now it's 31%. It hit a peak of 36%, so that's a massive drop from a population standpoint, but 31%. The best run organizations that are practicing management the way that I'm talking about here are at 70%, and that's a high bar. But they're more than double the U.S. average, more than triple the global average, and they've held that through the pandemic because their managers have built relationships with their employees in such a way that their employees can see beyond any kind of crisis that exists. They're resilient. When you have highly engaged employees, they're not only high performing in the moment, they're also resilient. They're more likely to be loyal to the organization. They're less likely to be looking elsewhere. They feel connected. So all of this is solvable, but we've got to get managers skilled in the right way to make it work right.
So define for me engagement, because you've used the word engagement several times, and I think it can be interpreted in different ways. From Gallup's perspective, what is an engaged employee?
An engaged employee is someone who is involved and enthusiastic with their work and workplace. Involved meaning they're cognitively connected to what the organization's about. They feel interested in what they're doing every day. Enthusiastic means there's an emotional component. But what leads to that set of conditions, involvement and enthusiasm, are some basic, I'd call them basic needs of employees. You call them basic needs of human nature. They've probably existed for long periods of time since the Industrial Revolution, maybe even back further than then. When we come to work, we need to know what's expected of us. We need to have the resources. We need to do our work. We need to have a chance to do what we do best. When we do good work, we need to be recognized for it. We need an environment where someone cares about us and where we have chances to develop. We need a purpose that we can connect to that's bigger than us. That's a part of human nature that management can appeal to, that not only improves the well-being of the individual, but also improves the performance and the efficiency of the organization. So when we define engagement, we define very specific elements that lead to high levels of involvement and enthusiasm. And again, it's a high bar, but everybody should be looking for a high bar if they want to build the right kind of culture that can survive going into the future.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me it's a very intentional building of culture. This is not culture by accident. This is culture by intent.
Exactly, it is. And there's nothing random about it. You've got to be very, like you said, intentional about how you set expectations, about how you listen to employees, how you listen to people close to the action and make sure their opinions count, how you honor the relationships inside the organization, how you give people opportunities to learn and grow, and how you discuss progress. Those are all things that are initiated by managers. All employees are responsible for contributing to that culture, but it happens best if it's initiated by the manager.
But it's also it's a management culture that is focused on coaching rather than managing. You know, I think there's kind of this divide, and you hear people talk about leaders versus managers. And, you know, it strikes me that the approach you're advocating is not, I'm making sure that Jim is doing his job. It's, I'm trying to build the best Jim that I can. And it's a collaborative process with Jim. I'm more of a coach than a manager.
And that's the way it should be, because most people come into organizations really wanting to make a difference in the organization. And then sometimes they get derailed. Too oftentimes they get derailed because, let's say you want to make a difference and nobody will clarify exactly what your role is, or they keep changing it on you and they don't explain why. So the coaching part is important. And coaching is really those three things I mentioned. It's about goal setting, and it's about ongoing conversation, and it's about accountability. But it's different from an administrative form of management. where we were checking a bunch of boxes and we're filling out forms on people. And at the end of the year, we're telling them how they're doing, and they didn't know along the way. Coaching is about people knowing how well they're doing throughout the year, throughout the weeks, actually. And it actually, if you take a coaching perspective, it makes a manager's job easier. Unfortunately, right now, managers feel increasingly burnt out. They're looking for other work. Managers on average aren't any more engaged than the employees they manage. It's not the best. That's not the case in the best run organizations, though, John. The best run organizations have highly engaged managers, and they've figured out that coaching makes their job easier. They're not trying to figure out or trying to resolve issues that have been sitting there for a long time and escalated. They get ahead of issues before they escalate, because they're in touch. So coaching is about being in touch.
I know from my own experience and from teaching culture-centric leadership that if we have a defined end state, right? Like I always say, you're not a team until you have a common objective, right? And I use the example of, you're driving down the street and you see a woman out and she's trying to push her car because she's out of gas. And two guys get out and help push the car. They're a team. And they're a team because they have a common purpose, which is to get her car to a gas station. If one goes to the front of the car and one goes to the back of the car, they're not a team anymore. They're adversarial. It is that common purpose that makes us a team. And it is the ability to work together that honestly is one of the things that defines human beings, is our ability to collaborate. But we somewhere kind of lost the way on leading people and started to view them as things that had to be managed. They had to be here at a certain time and they had to do a certain number of things. And that's not building teams, right? Like it's what you're advocating is that we're going to build a team. You and I are going to help push this lady's car to the gas station. And that team might only last till we get to the gas station, high five and off we go. Or it might last for our entire career. But if we're not as leaders giving common purpose, if we're not saying, hey, this is what we're trying to do, we literally could be pushing in opposite directions on the car and not even know it.
That's such an essential part of leadership, is purpose, a purpose that everybody in the organization can almost think of, not almost, can actually recite in terms of what their organization is about in one sentence. Here's what we're trying to get done. By the way, I was in Romania once, and that actually happened to me. The car ran out of gas about 2 a.m. I was with a colleague, and the driver got out and started pushing the car, and we got out and helped him. We pushed it downhill and got to a gas pump together. So that example actually played out in my life.
So real world example. Yeah, it's interesting because your research definitely has kind of revealed to me and just this conversation that we do need to reposition in our minds. Part of that disenfranchisement, I think, is we feel disconnected from the organization and from our leadership. And so as leaders, especially, top leaders, middle managers, we have to be trying to connect our individuals to the purpose of the organization and then helping them to figure out where they are in that purpose.
Yeah, and I think that like I said, the purpose needs to be really authentic in terms of what you're solving for as an organization and how you're contributing to your end customer, however you define that customer. But it's got to be not only defined in a clear way so that it resonates with everybody in the organization at whatever job they're doing. But you can do that, but you've also got to get the basics right before people start really believing that. So they might come into the organization and say, this is the best. This is such a great purpose. I want to be a part of this. But then they get into their work and they don't know what their job is, or they don't have what the organization promised them from a resources standpoint, or they do great work and they don't get recognized for it, or they don't see how they can progress inside the organization once they get there. And that happens too often where, you've got a well-defined purpose, but you don't have the basics you need to do it. And so the organization loses credibility. So that's where really good management happens. And it's not, some of it, like I said earlier, is low-hanging fruit. It just gets overlooked because somehow we've gotten into a mentality that people are more like machines almost, where there's a set of principles that we should follow with each person the same way. Where in the end, each person is a little bit different. Each person has their own strengths, and the only way you really can get into those idiosyncrasies and tie them to that mission or purpose is through great managers.
Yeah, one of my favorite sayings is that machines are managed, people are led.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that, just to kind of sum up your lessons learned for us, like as an intentional coach and manager, I need to be setting clear priorities and goals for the people that work for me intentionally. I need to be, having an ongoing conversation on a regular basis with them to recognize what they're doing, to collaborate, to work on their strengths and development and understand their focus of work. And then, the third thing is I need to make sure that I'm giving them accountability and feedback so that they know where they are on the path of development.
Exactly.
Jim, fascinating conversation. I appreciate you so much coming on Lessons Learned and sharing what you've learned.
Thanks for having me, John. Great to be with you.
Thank you.